everyone, and good evening. I am your host, Jason Miles, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. If you're new to the channel, please hit like, subscribe, and don't forget to hit that notification bell as we're adding new shows and cross streams to the channel constantly. Also, very important, this is our last show that we're going to do for the week, Pascal and I, as we are heading off to New York City, for our live show at Project PARLOR in Brooklyn. I shouldn't say live show. It's a launch party for Stagflation Media. Pascal and I are definitely going to be there. Deep State Cuba is going to be there. So if you want to meet us all in person, if you want to meet the shadowy figure that is Deep State Cuba, who sadly is not going to be here today, but that's okay. I believe we have an extremely suitable replacement. But Cuba is going to be there in New York. If you want to meet Doug Lane, Ben Burgess is going to be there. Margaret Kimberly is going to be there from Black Agenda Report. Sean KB from the Antifada is going to be there. It's a free show, June 26th, 3 p.m. to 10 p.m. There's going to be live music, a DJ, and of course, a panel discussion. This is going to be great. Also, if you haven't caught it, my co-host, my homie, my dog, had a wonderfully insightful appearance on the Bad Faith podcast with Brianna Joy Gray. I was also a guest recently on the Majority Report with Sam Cedar. Please check those things out. Sam and I talked about the latest video essay, same as it ever was. Also, I was recently a guest with Doug Lane. I guess he hasn't posted that show yet. Maybe he's waiting for me to finish my article. I feel like Pascal now. I haven't finished my article. I am writing an article that will go with the same as it ever was video essay. It's going to be a little more in depth, definitely with more quotes. And then you can see where I got some of my source material for the research I was doing. Let me bring in my co-host, my homie, my dog, the man of the Mau Mau Hour, the Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles.
There's some people, someone said they're jealous they don't live in New York. There's some people making the trip out. Like Strom McCallum is coming all the way from South Carolina. So I'm super excited for that. Get to meet Strom in real life.
Deep South.
There's also probably going to be some special guests that show up as well. Not necessarily on the panel, but show up. I talked to Zine Magubane a while back. She said she was thinking about coming through. I don't want to name anybody else's name because some names get the chat a little more inflamed than others. But I'm excited for New York. But this is our last show before we go. And also, I talked about this a little bit on Tuesday. A friend of mine has a cousin who's an elementary school teacher in the city that I grew up in, Richmond, California, and she is trying to raise money for her classroom. As you guys know, public schools are extremely underfunded, and where I'm from, Richmond, California, we have quite a few underfunded public schools. And I just want to bring in teacher, educator, Miss Miss Mariela Gomez.
Hello. Hi, guys.
Thank you for joining us. M. Tucson, have you put up the link yet?
About to post it right now.
Okay. So M. Tucson is posting a link on YouTube. And this is a link where if you can donate money to Miss Gomez's class, because there's kind of some basic things that you need for your class that the school, of course, cannot provide.
Yes. So I actually have a couple of projects that are on Donors Choose. It is it's an organization that is mostly dedicated towards educators gaining supplies or materials for their classroom. I prefer this website over others like GoFundMe just because of the transparency behind it and showing exactly where your donations go towards the classroom. And some of the supplies that I'm asking for include a color printer so that I can add a little bit more color to my classroom, which is a TK classroom, as you mentioned before. It's more towards younger kids who are 4 to 5 year olds. And honestly, I really just want to bring in some more exciting, more engaging materials into my classroom as well. So yeah, that's why I'm trying to get this funded.
So for today, we would really appreciate. Don't send us any super chats. Anything you guys would like to do, we really appreciate it. And Pascal and I are not rich by any stretch of the imagination. And I get terrified crossing the imaginary line that you lovely people call the United States, because my prices go up tremendously from gas to just food costs. That being said, it is more important that these young people have the type of education that I think they deserve. Primarily, you have brown and black children in your classroom, Mariella.
Yes. As I was mentioning before, Paris Elementary serves about 540 students, and about 70% of my students are a Latino background. The second highest, oh, pardon me, I live in Richmond, so you're going to hear some of those phrases. That's another thing. I live in the community that I serve, which, you know, I personally feel it's like a one up for me because I love this city. I love Richmond and all of its special kids, and that's why I'm asking for these things because unfortunately, a lot of the materials that I'm asking for are things that are based on STEM, which is science based, math based materials, which, as you know, go a long way when you have materials based off of like equality, education gap. All these things are things that I personally would love to close a little bit more.
You got any words, Pascal?
I want to really encourage you in your endeavor to try to raise these funds for your school because we definitely support education and the importance of youth education. Kids that young definitely need the best tools that they can. So, our viewers, please, if you can, support and be generous in your ability to help Ms. Gomez here in terms of trying to raise those funds for our kids.
Yes. And if I can also just plug in as well, there's an opportunity for you to look at other classrooms that also have this need, which I had pointed out before. Donors Choose is a organization that is made primarily for educators. So a lot of these classrooms are classrooms that are asking for funds or asking for materials. Uh, I would greatly encourage you guys if you would like to fund any other projects, please do so because a lot of these educators are just like me, just trying to make a better impact for their students.
And again, guys, the link for this is in the chat. So please check that out. Here, I'm putting it on the screen so you guys can see. It's in the chat. I have, oh, there you go. Come on. I've pinned it. It is a pinned message. It should be at the top of the page. So anyone that is watching the show now, it is definitely there.
Can I add?
Yes, please add.
Ms. Gomez will only receive her materials if this project is fully funded by September 29th.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes, there is a deadline with this as well. That's one of the good and bad things about it is that if the project isn't fully funded, of course, money is returned to the donators. Which as looking from that side, I really appreciate the fact that the money isn't going to be kept. But as an educator, I really do hope that I get it funded. Of course.
well, right now on all of our platforms, the show just started, and it's the viewer count definitely goes up.
Yes.
But there's over 80 people watching right now. If everybody dropped 5 to 10, we could probably get this thing funded tonight. So I would love to Jerry Lewis this thing and get it funded in a day. Infinite Content says, I just donated $5 to the cause. It's a shame teachers need to crowdfund, but cops cannibalize municipal budgets. I
Say it
agree with you.
again for the people in the back.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
That is 100% true. 100% true. I cannot deny that one bit. And in light of Stacey Abrams' comments today, where she felt cops don't make enough money.
Oh, she went that route?
You didn't see? She said cops are very important, and they don't have the salary that's a living wage, and we need to pay cops more money. They literally made almost double what teachers made in her state. I believe teachers were at 31,000 on average a year, and law enforcement in her state was 54,000 on average a year.
You mean Stacey Abrams, the darling of the black political class?
Yes. Yes. Got Negroes out there to vote. Vote for them cops.
Woo!
Yes. Also, thank you. One of the a new commenter to the show. Thank you. Says that they're going to share the link. It would be beautiful if everyone watching the show shared the link amongst their social media as well. Because also maybe we should start changing this conversation around municipal funding for law enforcement, and let's talk about funding for public school teachers who are constantly dealing with a warehousing situation, especially when it comes to their poor Black and brown students, and especially in a city like where I come from, which I know the demographics are changing drastically, and I know the location of Perry's Elementary was always kind of the quote unquote hood school, quote unquote.
Yes.
And also let's not discount the fact that Mrs. Gomez is literally from the area which she teaches in, which is something that we're seeing be more and more strange as teachers can't even afford to live in the cities in which they teach. So this is a real I don't know, for me personally, it just hit really close to home as soon as I saw Lupe post that that thing about you. So shout out to Lupe and James, and we wish you the best of luck. It looks like people are already starting to donate, so we're not going to stop talking about this for the whole show. And in the champagne room, is there anything you want to say, Miss Gomez, before we bring in our guest for the evening?
Yes. Just as I had mentioned before, thank you all so very much for everything that you guys are doing for me, for my students. I really appreciate just the thoughtfulness of your viewers, of you guys, for bringing me out here. And I ask that you just spread this not only to myself, but to my fellow educators that are on Donors Choose, so that I can help them achieve their goals as well. Because I'm not just thinking about my students. I'm thinking about all the kiddos who are out there. If you can, I really, really appreciate that.
Oh, shout out to Omar. Thank you, Omar. Just donated $50. Thank you
Omar.
so much. So
you guys.
Well, I hope you watched the show, Monty.
Of course, I'm gonna stay here.
All right. Well, I'm going to bring in our guest. I'm gonna. There you go. Bam. Let's bring in our guest. You know him as everyone's favorite Marxist economist. He's kind of the godfather of the Marxist economists on here. I think, is Dr. Jack older than Richard Wolff?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Do they have economist battles, Dr. Jack and Richard Wolff?
I don't know if there's the beatbox playing in the background.
It's not like rappers.
I can't answer that question.
It's dancers. It's dancers. You got to take out the cardboard.
Oh, it's like dancers.
Maybe.
Well,
yeah.
I would love to see Dr. Jack and Richard Wolff have a Charleston off.
Getting sketchy territory there, comrade.
Pull back, comrade. Pull back.
Please welcome the author of the latest piece in I saw it in LA Progressive. I actually saw it in LA Progressive the day before he emailed me, which is shocking. The Anatomy of Inflation. Mr. Dr. Jack Rasmus.
Dr. Jack Rasmus, it's an honor for you to be on our show. I know you by not only your copious appearances on This Is Revolution podcast, but also by your constant intervention of some fiery tweets whenever I'm making commentary on the economy, that you are coming in and just dispelling any kind of romanticized notions anyone has about anything, and basically just dropping this hot lead into the conversation to make everyone realize that, this ain't Kansas anymore, kids.
Yeah. No, that's very true.
Indeed.
Well, Dr. Jack, your new article in the LA Progressive, The Anatomy of Inflation, you explain why the Fed won't be able to tamp down inflation without us going into a recession.
Right.
Go ahead, Pascal. You want to say something? Sorry.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a question off the gate, based on your article. Well, even maybe not so much on the article, but on an occurrence that I'm sure you were well aware of that happened. Dr. Rasmus, Larry Sumner stated that we needed several years of unemployment at over 5% to find a way out of this inflationary bubble that we have right now. I want to ask you, do you see or do you consider that one of the reasons for the extreme reaction to the inflation by the Fed and the banking sector and the lords of capital is that they want to discipline labor in the wake of the post-COVID job markets and in labor militancy? Do you think that's part of one of the possible reasons why they're so aggressive in pushing this inflation and the need to respond?
Well, surely that's one of them. But wage increases aren't that responsible for inflation. The Fed is really attacking demand, destroying demand. In other words, destroying wage incomes. The Fed's decided we're going to have a recession. Okay, that train's left the station. No doubt about that. The only question is how soon. And then, of course, how deep and how long. I think it may occur, toward the end of this year, in the final months of this year. Others are saying early next year. But that's a done deal. But the thing to understand is that the Federal Reserve can only address demand. In other words, take it out on incomes to depress the demand for goods and services, and therefore the extent to which demand drives the price of goods and services. The problem with inflation is that it's not primarily due to demand. The problem is it's due to supply side in a number of forms, one of which is global supply chains are still broken. They haven't healed after COVID, one. Two, domestic supply chains are still broken, and I'm talking about the transport system and the warehousing system. Three, corporations, particularly monopolistic corporations, meaning those industries where 4 or 5 of them control 70, 80% of the market share, the sales. They are taking advantage of the general awareness of inflation by price gouging everybody. And at the top of the list is the oil companies, and we can talk why, but also, the food processing companies and other goods producing companies. They're taking advantage and they're price gouging. They may not have a supply problem or a demand problem, but they're doing it anyway because they can. You got to understand that at the end of last year, those were the main drivers of inflation before this year actually began, and new forces are adding to inflation this year. If you look at the consumer price index last year, prices began to open up. In other words, began to rise moderately in May and June of last year as the economy began to open up and people got wages and got jobs and they started buying things they couldn't buy before and services and so forth. But it was only 4%. If you look at the next 4 months, June, July, August and early September, inflation was stable at 5.5%. It rose a little bit, but it was stable. The escalation of prices does not begin until late August, September of last year, when you started to have the supply chain problems and the price gouging began. That's when inflation started to rise noticeably. And it's not the American Rescue Plan that put money in people's pockets that drove up the demand. It was reopening the economy modestly. Why do I say that? It's not the demand from the ARP, right? The checks that people got and the unemployment benefits that they got and the child care that they got for a little while, right? The Republicans and Larry Summers and all that ilk like to say, oh, it's too much money. We gave people too much money. And now they're too much demand and they're driving up prices. Well, as I said a little while ago, if you look at over the summer, prices were pretty stable. They were a little higher because the economy was opening, but they were pretty stable. And they don't take off into the latter part, September, October, and thereafter because of price gouging, supply chains, and global supply chains. Okay? And another way of refuting this idea that it was a rescue plan that was responsible, they say $1.9 trillion. No. That program only authorized $800 billion in the first year. So quarter to quarter, it was maybe $200 billion that got into the economy when the third quarter prices finally started to rise a little bit. $200 billion. And not all of that was actually spent. Economists got this thing called marginal propensity to consume, meaning you give a certain amount of money in the economy. People don't spend it all at once. They usually spend about 3/4 of it. Right? And if you're rich, you spend even less than that. So maybe $150 billion got into the economy in the third quarter. Now you compare $150 billion on a third quarter US GDP of $5.5 trillion. There's no way $150 billion could start escalating prices the way we saw it last September, October, November, December. It was price gouging. It was supply chains. Now, what happens is you get into 2022 and you got new forces adding to the problem. And guess what that is? That is Biden's war and the sanctions that drive up global commodity prices because Russia controls a big share of commodity prices, 20 to 30% of oil, even more percent of natural gas, industrial commodities, metals of various kinds that go into cars, palladium, and nickel and so forth. Agricultural commodities, it controls 20-30% of wheat production, 75% of sunflower seeds, 75%, which is oil, baking, cooking oil, 75% of potash, which is fertilizer. You start sanctioning all that. In other words, you reduce the supply of that. You got another big supply problem. Supply side driving the inflation, adding to the price gouging, adding to the supply chains. It's not demand. In fact, consumer spending is weakening for people with 75,000 and under a year annual income. It's supply side, and the big factor that hit us was this commodities inflation because of the sanctions and to some extent the war in Ukraine, itself. But even before those sanctions started taking effect, which they just are now, once the sanctions were announced, what happened was global speculators, commodity futures speculators in markets, because all of these industrial commodities and oil are traded on markets, and they started jacking up their prices in anticipation of the sanctions even occurring. There's, the metals market, there's the gas market, there's the oil markets. So we got these global capitalist speculators jumping on board, driving the price, and then we got actual sanctions that are starting, and then the speculators jump on top of that. So now what we got is inflation that is chronic and embedded. It's not going away this year, and it's only going to start going away when the Federal Reserve precipitates a recession and takes out on the backs of consumers, demand side, what is really a supply side, speculators, war, price gouging problem. But Biden won't address that. You know, we can talk about the silly little things he's doing just for public relations purposes, but it's a supply side primarily problem. It's not a demand side. But Larry Summers and his ilk like to say, oh, it's a demand side. People have too much money. You know, the 2020 bailout and the 2021 rescue plan just put too much money into the hands of consumers. You know, and they were saying, oh, there's 25% savings rate. But they don't mention that the savings rate now is less than it was in 2008. It's down to 4.4%. So it's not that people have so much money, particularly working class folks and middle class folks. They don't, right? Maybe the top 10% and 1%, coupon clippers, speculators and stock buyers, they have a lot. They're sitting on a big pot. But the rest of the people aren't. It's not demand side, it's supply side. And the politicians, especially Biden, will not touch the oil companies. He will talk the talk and make it look like he's complaining about them, but he won't do anything. And the proof is his secretary, energy secretary, Jeanette Granholm, met today with the oil companies, and she's talking to them with velvet gloves. You know, she won't really go after them. There is a solution to this that's pretty simple that's been done before.
What is that?
It's very simple. One, you freeze prices, gasoline prices, rent prices, and all the others for 90 days. You freeze it, and then you roll them back 20%. You institute a windfall profits tax. That's the short-run solution to this. And it was done before. In fact, Richard Nixon did it in 1971. He froze prices for 90 days. And then 2 years, he had price and wage controls to keep it dampened down. Harry Truman did it. FDR did it for 4 years. There is a solution to it, but the Democratic Party is so much in the pocket of the big corporations now that they won't even raise these possibilities. I mean, it's not even on the agenda, and the media won't even challenge them on it. Why aren't you doing this? I mean, we've done it before. It's worked before. What's new? You know, longer term, I think the solution to energy prices, because half of this inflation, 50-60% of it is all energy prices. It's all crude oil, it's gasoline, it's diesel, it's utilities costs of energy costs, it's food processing costs. It's all 50-60% is energy. The oil companies are the fundamental cause of this problem going on, and they won't address it. They won't go after it. Longer term, I would say beyond just a price freeze, beyond just a windfall profits tax. By the way, oil companies last quarter made $40 billion more in profits because of the price hikes. And you know what they're doing with that $40 billion? They're using it to spend on stock buybacks and dividends. It's a massive redistribution of income.
Upward.
Upward. Well, not even upward. It's going upward in one direction to the stockholders of the oil and energy companies. The longer run, the way to deal with this is that the U.S. should nationalize one of these big four companies and become the price leader in that industry.
Like some of these other states do.
Like other countries do and whatever, right? Nationalize it, take it over, make it a government oil corporation and control the prices. Make the others bend to the prices, because if they start jacking up prices, you just lower the government price and that undermines them. That's all you have to do long run. And that's not, rocket science either. All kind of countries have national oil companies, right? And they control the prices and the inflation to the extent that they might in the global economy. That's my position in a nutshell on all of this. We can talk about some of the silly measures that Biden's doing, but that's the solution to this. And it's not going away unless you want the other solution, which is precipitate a recession and take it out on the backs of consumers and workers' income. In other words, destroy demand, which is what Larry Summers is saying, right?
Mhm.
destroy demand, take it out on their backs, which is really a supply side problem. And this isn't the first time we saw this happen, by the way. The same thing happened in 1981, 82, when we had the Middle East problem, OPEC, and they were, Iranian Revolution, and they were dragging up the prices, supply side, global supply side problem, oil companies, right? What did the government do? What did Carter and then Reagan, what did they do? They raised interest rates of 15%. And took it out on the backs and shut down the auto industry, shut down the housing industry.
Was destroyed. But that's also why a lot of people were able to buy houses in that era. No one likes to talk about this for like $15,000, $20,000, $30,000, right? Because interest rates were so astronomically high, 15, 16, sometimes 20% interest rates on 30 and 15-year mortgages. I actually had to do some research on that when I worked in that industry for a while. I do want to ask you, we have a super chat question here, Dr. Jack. Somebody says, hi, Jack. And it's Dr. Jack. It's not just Jack. You don't know him like that. Ian.
That's
Dr.
okay.
Jack,
That's okay.
can you give a critique of the monetarist approach? I believe they simply argue that it's a surplus of money, of money supply. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, that's the old ideological argument in economics. Ideology meaning misrepresentation of fact and reality, not an ism, right? Manipulate language so you can confuse people and misrepresent the truth. That's what ideology is. The ideological proposition is too much money chasing too few goods, right? That's what they really say. That goes way back to the classical economics. There's the Adam Smith and all those guys way back when who didn't understand how the banking system really worked, right? And who came along and said, money cannot influence the real economy. Money only causes inflation. If you have excess money, given the amount of goods in the economy, you're going to automatically, logically get inflation, right? That was called the neutrality of money proposition. Well, it was BS. We know it's BS. We know money and interest rates do influence the real economy. But, we still have people running around, even top professors like John Taylor at Stanford, still peddling this nonsense, Too much money, too few goods. But it's nonsense. It's not true. There's no empirical test to show that this is true. They tried it once back in the early Reagan period, right? Milton Friedman, one of the great ideologists of economics, believed in that proposition. Too much money, too few goods. And all you had to do was control the amount of money, the supply of money in the economy. And if you could keep it stable and growing at the same rate as GDP, then you wouldn't have inflation. Well, they tried that in 81, 82, 3. It was a total failure. It didn't control the economy or inflation or anything. And even Reagan threw that out, out the window, that it was nonsense. But look, there are economists whose role is to justify certain powerful economic interests. And they manipulate economic ideas. That's what we call ideology in economics, as opposed to science in economics. Science is you observe reality, right? And inductively, you make observations and you make your conclusions based on what you observe, right? Well, ideology is what we call deductive reasoning, and you state a conclusion, and then you go look and cherry pick evidence and twisted evidence to fill your conclusion. Well, a lot of economic analysis, including that proposition, too much money chases too few goods, is just that. You say, oh, inflation is too much money, and therefore you fill it in. But why do they say that? Too much money chasing too few goods is the question, right? Because if you say that, then you totally reject fiscal policy as any solution to economic growth or controlling inflation. That's the purpose of it. In other words, throw it in the hands of the Federal Reserve and wash your hands of it if you're in Congress and let the Fed take the heat.
Haven't we been pretty much in that monetarist posture for pretty much 50 years now.
Yeah, there's variations of it that have never died. I mean, it's always been there. It really came to the fore in the 1970s when the neo-Keynesian solution broke down for controlling the economy. I say neo-Keynesian because not Keynes. There's a difference. And the monetarists stepped into the economic policy vacuum with their explanations, right? And then they went bust. But both of these remnants are still bouncing around in academia here, and they haven't gone away because their useful purpose is to justify policy by the politicians on behalf of the wealthy interests who they own, right? To justify the tax cuts, right? 4.5 trillion tax cuts over a decade in 2018 under Trump. $4.5 trillion of tax cuts given to wealthy investors and speculators and financiers and the wealthy 1%. $4.5 trillion. Now, the argument was, right? Oh, business tax cuts create jobs. That's another one of these phony ideological propositions. There's no evidence to that either, empirically, that the more tax cuts you give business, the more jobs you're going to get. I mean, just look at what's been happening in the last 20 years in terms of job creation. It just doesn't exist.
Well, what about those who are acolytes of the Trump administration who say that Trump's tax cuts is why he had such a wonderful, quote unquote, job growth during his presidency?
Yeah, well, the only reason he had job growth had nothing to do with the tax cuts, because I'll tell you why. The idea of the tax cuts were supposed to generate business investment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And business investment would then increase production, and the production would then require more people to be hired. In the first year after the passage of the Trump tax cuts, investment went down. It went down. So the investment didn't create the jobs. Other things might have created the jobs in the global economy, but it wasn't the business investment, because that actually contracted after the tax cuts were passed. Well, where did all that money go? That $4.5 trillion. Well, the decade's not up, but we have 3-4 years after that. Where did all that money go? All that tax cut for businesses, if it didn't go into investment that created jobs? I'll tell you where it went. It went into the stock market. It went into equity markets. It went into other financial markets, foreign exchange markets, derivative markets. And we had the big bubble, right? Mm-hmm. And the wealthy people got even wealthier at a faster rate because the tax cuts did what? That put more cash in the hands of corporations. And what did those corporations do with that money? Stock buybacks and dividend payouts to their shareholders. Under Obama, stock buybacks and dividend payouts for just the Fortune 500 averaged $800 billion a year.
Oh.
Well, wait a minute. When Trump comes in and passes his tax cuts, the first 3 years, $1.3 trillion a year, just in the Fortune 500, distributing the tax cuts and other forms of their wealth, right, to their shareholders. 1.3 trillion, 3 years in a row. Of course, when COVID hit, then, that was an aberration. The thing collapsed there. But how about 2021, the first full year recovery under Biden? What's the level of dividends and stock buybacks for the Fortune 500? 1.4 trillion. Even better under Biden.
I want to address this super chat question here. We have another one, Dr. Jack. You are definitely getting people riled up.
Good. I want to get people riled up. Not enough people are pissed off.
They want to know more. Who better to ask than an educator? We always forget. I forgot to say this in your introduction, but Dr. Jack, well, you're retired from teaching, correct?
Well, I just finished this past semester. Yeah.
And Dr. Jack was a professor
St. Mary's College. Right?
St. Mary's College in the Bay Area. He's actually a Bay Area person. So, but great to have you back, Dr. Jack Rasmus. To what extent is U.S. monetary policy circa 1980 to 81 now influenced by US dollar being the global reserve currency. That's from JB, the good JB, as he shall
Okay.
always be known.
What is the relationship between monetary policy, let's say interest rates, right, and the US dollar?
Mhm.
Well, the more interest rates go up, the more the dollar goes up, especially if you've got stagnant growth or recessions in the rest of the world. Why is that? Because if no one's making a profit and they're in recession in the rest of the world, Latin America or wherever, right? But you can get 3-4% guaranteed treasury bonds in the US rather than losing money. What are you going to do? You're going to move your money into the US. You're going to buy treasury bonds. But to buy treasury bonds, you got to take your Argentina peso and you got to go into a currency market and buy US dollars. And that drives the value of the dollar up. So rising rates drives the value of the dollar up. The problem with that for the rest of the world is because the dollar is the global trading and reserve currency. If the dollar goes up, all the other currencies, all things equal, go down. So if you have rising interest rates and rising value of the dollar in the US, you've got falling value of the Argentine peso. And if the peso is falling, guess what? Argentina has to raise its interest rates to protect its currency, or a collapsed peso means it can't buy as much foodstuffs or medical goods from the rest of the world. It's got to spend more pesos to buy those things, right? And inflation occurs because of imports for them. So what we're doing is exporting our recession. First, we're exporting our inflation, and now exporting our recession to the rest of the world, which is very slow growth going on. And some of them are already in recession, and they're going to go deeper in recession. So what you got is the U.S., because the dollar is the trading currency, the reserve currency, right? It impacts the rest of the world. Whatever the U.S. does has a negative or positive effect on the rest of the world. And through the dollar. The dollar is the linchpin of the American global economic empire. Should that crack, then that empire is doomed economically.
But Dr. Jack, one of the reasons I want to ask you is that why are the conservatives and the bankers and the institutionalists so interested in painting the cause of this inflation as being a demand cause or the stimulus money that was put in the hands of working class people?
Well, that comes back to your first question, Pascal. And that is, if you say the problem is average workers got too much money, that means, well, we got to dampen that wage, right? We got to, contain wage incomes. We got to blame wages for what's going to happen. And to the extent you blame workers and wages, you distract people from the real cause, which is corporate price gouging and supply chains and the war and sanctions, right? So it serves the double purpose. If you can get people focused on wages, right? Another reason why they're starting to focus on wages is because workers are starting to get pissed off. And you can see it in some of the organizing going on, the young people, right? But I would say watch it for the transportation systems.
Really?
Yes. We got a railroad strike going on in the UK right now. Canadian workers are 40, 50,000 about to go on strike. And the contracts for the U.S. railroad workers run out on July 18th. You may see a significant transportation strike. And the longshore workers, the ALW, they're negotiating right now. There could be a transportation shutdown. And the response to that will be by the government and Biden to invoke what's called the Taft-Hartley Act.
Ooh.
Forced everybody back to work.
Back to work, yeah.
Yes.
But
that happened historically in 70-71. There's a parallel here. In 1970 and 71 was the second biggest strike wave in U.S. history. Second biggest. The only bigger one was right after World War II. But that was the biggest strike wave. It started with construction workers, spilled over to the Teamsters, and from the Teamsters to the auto workers, and then to transport workers, longshore and so forth. Now listen to this. the unions were winning these strikes because they had national agreements at that time, big, broad agreements. They could shut things down with it. Right? They've broken those up since then. But those national contracts, they were getting 25% raises in 3-year contracts in the first year of the 3-year term. 25% raises. In other words, the corporations, the capitalists could not stop them. That's why they brought in Richard Nixon to freeze prices and freeze wages for 90 days. And then he really rolled back all these 25% gains to 5.5%. That's coming too.
Difference.
Hmm.
Do
Wow.
you think? How do you think
it helps to know your history a little bit, especially your labor history. I started out as a labor economist. I spent 13 years in the union movement at the grassroots, not as some staff guy, as an organizer for 4 different unions, and then an elected local president for the communications union, doing all the negotiations and running the strikes and doing the organizing and so forth. So I know what's going on at the grassroots. That's where my roots are. I mean, I'm a working class guy. I'm the first guy from my family to go to high school, graduate from high school, and I spent a long time in the labor movement and saw, all the great things about it and all of the warts, which are largely still there. Right?
Well,
Right.
a lot of the movements that we're seeing in labor have to do with the hospitality industry or like the service industry, right? So we're seeing like a lot of we're seeing small movements when it comes to Amazon, but when it comes to like Starbucks and things like that, you're seeing a lot of unionizing with Starbucks. Do you think any of these labor movements, if they really do start to get like real true momentum, might get broken up with the use of undocumented labor?
Well, that's always been a tactic, except the unions to give them their credit, like the I think it's called Unite Here now. It used to be the hotel and restaurant when I was in it. Have oriented to the undocumented workers and have had great successes organizing a lot of them, Latinos and heavily undocumented workers in the Southwest. So I don't think they're going to be able to pull that one off that much. Plus, they're not letting undocumented workers in the country anymore, right? They got that damn fence up.
I got to pass by that fence every time I cross that imaginary line now that I live in Mexico. And I will say this, I find it really interesting that there's a problem with hiring, right? Not a lot of people want to go back to work. Generally, a lot of younger people worked a lot of these service industry jobs, right? And for a while, it was more profitable for people to walk away from their job with the unemployment bonus and stimulus money. Now that's kind of no more. Then there was a bit of a hiring bonus where you don't see so many maybe coming from south of the border. I don't know how big the influx has been from people coming from Eastern Europe, like the Ukraine, but giving temporary protective status to a lot of those Ukrainian refugees. We'll see what Biden does as far as temporary protective status for some Haitian refugees that are still in the U.S. A lot are down here where I am, even on this side of Mexico. I just never put that past the ruling class to use immigration. I think we're going to stop seeing that be a hot talking point. And then then once they get where they want to go, then maybe, it becomes a talking point again to see more ICE sweeps.
I don't think to the extent they used to do it, they can do it or will do it. So my view is a little bit different than that. I'm not saying it won't happen, but, a lot of Ukrainians come over because they can afford to come over. They're not going to go pick strawberries.
No, I agree with you on that. It's more so in the, like I said, more so in like the service industry. And you know, you're right. You know, if you can afford to come over here, you can afford to come over here. But there are
I wanted
people.
to ask you another question, Dr. Jack. Can you define stagflation for our audience, and why do you think that we're in the verge of facing it, or maybe there already? I know we've had one negative quarter of growth in the first quarter of the 2022. We had negative GDP, and people are prospecting that the second quarter of 2022 might be negative as well, which would be officially a recession. So I'd like to know what do you, because you talk in your article about prognostication about stagflation. Can you define stagflation for our audience, and why do you think it's something we might be facing?
Yeah, stagflation is economic growth that is at zero or less. In other words, contracting, right? Amidst inflation, prices that keep rising. Okay, it's really that simple. No growth or contracting growth. A recession, and at the same time you got prices. Now, as I said earlier, you can expect prices to keep rising throughout the rest of this year. And even Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, after a couple of months ago saying, "Oh, it's going to be temporary," then she wipes the egg off her face and she apologizes and she says, "Now, well, it's locked in," right? So at least throughout the rest of this year, you're going to see chronic high inflation continuing. Now, in the first quarter of this year, January to March, we had an actual contraction of GDP, which is the measure of growth in the economy, gross domestic product, right? It contracted a minus 1.5%, which is pretty healthy when you think about it. Recessions are usually a 2 to 4% a year contraction. So the first quarter was certainly a contraction, and certainly we had inflation escalating. So in a sense, we had stagflation in the first quarter of this year. Now the second quarter isn't over, but the Atlanta Federal Reserve does the shadow GDP prediction, and a week or so ago it predicted no growth in the second quarter, and the quarter's not even over, right? So no growth following a contraction of 1.5% means you got real stagnation going on at least. And if the Fed now keeps raising interest rates at the schedule it's talking about, certainly we're going to precipitate a more serious contraction. I mean, this is very interesting to me because very clearly the Fed knows the economy is dragging its feet. It knows it. I could cite some other statistics if you want on purchasing managers indexes in the housing industry and so forth. The Fed knows it, but all the Fed is talking about is inflation, inflation, inflation. Although, in his testimony before the Senate Finance Committee yesterday, Fed Chairman Jerome Powell, when pressed on it, admitted, well, recession is a possibility, right? I mean, what's he going to say? Yeah. He's not going to say yeah, but when he says there's a possibility, you know damn well that he knows it's going to happen. And it is going to happen. Question is when and how severe. That's it. So they know it's going to happen. I mean, even guys like Jamie Dimon, the head of Chase Bank, comes out and, loosely says there's a hurricane coming, batten down the hatches. He's talking about economic.
But we've had so much of a growth in the securities industry since 2008, with the stock buybacks, with the quantitative easing, with all of the securitization money that was pumped into the market. We saw almost triple-digit percentage growth in the financial services sector, all done with this QE, this paper money printed out of nowhere. And yet, why is it surprising anyone after such completely monstrous policy took the economy to such heights that after COVID, the economy crashes?
Well, what's your question?
I said, why are people so surprised that the economy crashed after COVID in the face of all this Federal Reserve jigging of numbers to keep the economy afloat?
Well, you got to understand, when the Fed uses QE, quantitative easing, right? It pumps money, it injects money into the economy, into the banks. It goes through the banks. Although QE, the Fed bypasses the banks and goes to individual investors and, buys treasury bonds, individual investors hold and mortgage bonds and so forth. So it doesn't all go through the banks. But the point is, When COVID hit in March of 2020, the Fed immediately threw trillions of dollars at the banks. Trillions. The idea was, oh, well, maybe the banks are in trouble. We don't want to have another 2008-9 event, right? So we got to just flood the banks with all this extra money. And they flooded them with $5 trillion, folks. They gave the banks and investors $5 trillion. And you know what? They didn't even need it. They weren't in trouble, unlike 2008 and 9. Big corporations and the banks were sitting on a mountain of cash. The big corporations went out and they drew down their loan lines, borrowing lines with the banks. Sat on that, hoarded that cash. They issued a record level of corporate bonds, and they sat on that cash. And businesses then didn't have to pay wages to their employees, and they sat on that cash. They're sitting on trillions of dollars. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, some of them took some of this cash, which is at least $10 trillion, right? And they parked it back in the Federal Reserve because they didn't know what to do with it. $2 trillion went back into the Federal Reserve, which the Federal Reserve is now paying them 0.25% interest for, just to park the money, the free money that the Federal Reserve gave them in the first place. Figure that one out.
Well, real quick before we go, I want to ask you about this, Dr. Jack. Recently, Crystal Ball, who is a podcaster, show host, was on Bill Maher's show. I forget what it's called. Is it still called Politically Incorrect? What's it called? Bill Maher.
Oh.
Bill Maher's a douchebag on HBO. I don't know what it's called. The show's called. It's called Bill Maher's a doucher. And basically, she brought up the fact that there was a stock crash during COVID, and her guests and the hosts seemed to get some sort of amnesia about that stock crash that happened in the early time of COVID. Could you quickly explain that early on stock crash and why maybe some people don't remember it?
Yeah, well, when the initial shutdown of the economy occurred in March, April of 2020, it looked like no one was going to have any income. They weren't working, they weren't going to buy anything. Corporate profits would fall through the floor, and stock prices reflect the earnings. And speculators, in stock, sold off, much of their holdings in expectation that the prices were going to fall eventually anyway. So that's why you got that deep stock contraction going on initially. But once it became clear that the economy wasn't going to really hurt big businesses, medium and big large businesses, and many of them just blew right through COVID there, the whole quote problem. It was the small business and the workers who really paid for the shutdowns. As soon as that was clear, boom, the stock market goes right back up, and it just kept marching up as it was clear that the Fed threw $5 trillion into investors' hand. What are they going to do with it? Well, they're going to buy stocks, among other things. So it wasn't a normal stock crash, and very temporary.
All right. Well, we've hit an hour. Is the teacher still? Oh, Teach, you're still with us. Your sound is gone, and that's fine. We're just going to give you some good news.
I muted.
Okay. You muted. I pooted. There you go. Have a good time. Rhymed again. It looks like, from what I'm hearing, that you hit your goal.
I did. I am ecstatic. Thank you all so very much. I really appreciate it so much that you were able to help me with this.
Well,
Can I add something to that?
Yes.
Perhaps, she's a bit bashful, but I'll say it. I don't mind. She's got another project that needs to be funded. This one, all the donations are currently doubled. So someone is offering matching funds, it seems.
Yes.
And,
I believe it's General Motors who's double.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Awesome. And this is a totally attainable goal. You can do
Yes.
this, guys. You
Amazing.
can do this.
Well, I want to
Cool.
thank everybody that has watched the show. I'm going to take whatever super chat total that we have at the end of the night, and I'm going to definitely put that towards our This is Revolution donation. Um, it's a beautiful thing to see the community come together. Not only does everybody seem fired up about this topic at hand, which is inflation, which is the real economy that we're talking about, but also it's beautiful to see people come together to help out the children.
Yes. I cannot thank you all enough for everything that you have done for my kids. And I'm also going to just go ahead and take this opportunity just to remind, if you guys are able to, please go ahead and take a look at my comrades, my fellow educators on Donors Choose. If you are willing to help out other educators and other students around, it would be amazing.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. I would say I've talked to Madi just a little bit before the other night when we were trying to plan this thing out. She's actually a very animated person, but dealing with you people's badass kids has just exhausted the hell out of her. So that's why she's so. That's what that
Yeah, yeah. After teaching summer school, it's, at the end of the day, I'm just like, "Ugh."
is. Summer school
Yes, summer
for you
school.
people's badass kids. Just kidding. Well, thank you very much, Monty. Dr. Jack, you're going to join us for the champagne room for a little bit, right?
Sure, I'll join you. Right.
So if you guys want to ask Dr. Jack more questions and you want to call in and ask him on air, always ask to try to be.
Yeah, we haven't really said everything we can about why prices are going to continue to rise here for the rest of the year. We kind of ended up with the sanctions and the war, but there are other forces that are coming to bear, adding into the mix now. They're going to keep prices rising.
Well, if
Okay.
you guys want to know more about that, if you guys want to ask Dr. Jack more questions, because he is a teacher, I'm going to ask him some teacher questions. That's what he's here for. Do that in the champagne room. There's only one way to be in the champagne room, and that's be a patron. Patreon.com/Bitter Lake Presents. For as low as $30 for the year, you can have access to the call-in only patron bonus. You can also have access to movie night. We're going to do movie night when me and Pascal get back from New York. Pascal's going to do the Mau Mau hour when we get back from New York. So much awesome. We're going to probably add a new thing since I'm not going to do video essays. I am going to do something with most likely movies, most likely horror movies. It's going to be fun. It's going to be silly. It's going to be me. So, on that note, let's play the night music. So, enjoy the cartoons and capitalist realism of my youth and music I made for my child. Have a good night. We'll see you guys in the champagne room. And if not, we'll see y'all next week. Don't forget the show is still going live Saturday with Jean Bajlan and Stefan. Peace.